It is a cold August morning in the year 1612. Inside the courtroom of Lancaster Castle, silence hangs like fog. No chatter, no sobbing, no clanking of chains. Just one scream, shrill, desperate, echoing off stone walls, as a woman is dragged from the dock, kicking and howling. She screams one name over and over again, Jennet, but the girl does not answer. She is already standing nose-staged on a wooden table in the center of the courtroom. 9 years old. Her cheeks are flushed. Her voice is clear. Her arm outstretched with the certainty of a priestess delivering judgment. My mother is a witch. I have seen her spirit take the shape of a brown dog named Ball. The dog asked what she would have him do, and she told him to kill. Her voice does not tremble. The courtroom watcher's breath held. This is no longer just a child. This is the star witness. And the woman she condemns with icy precision is not a stranger. It is her own mother. Jennet Device, a barefoot beggar girl from the crumbling Malkin Tower, just became the instrument of law and execution. Her testimony would lead to the hanging of 10 people, including her entire family. Some called it justice. Others called it murder by proxy. But whatever you call it, one fact remains. 20 years later, Jennet would stand in that same courtroom again. Only this time she would be the accused. Only this time another child would take the stand. Only this time there would be no table, just a noose waiting quietly outside. This is not just the tale of a child and her family. It is a story of fear, weaponized of words turned to knives, of how a society can hang its own mothers and daughters on the strength of whispers. Welcome to Pendle. The year is 1612, and a little girl has just rewritten the meaning of guilt. Pendle was not London. It wasn't even close. Tucked deep in the northern wilds of Lancashire, it was a region whispered about more than spoken of. A dark corner of the kingdom, as one courtier put it. A place of bogs, crags, and ancient hills, where the past clung to the present like moss to stone. To the newly crowned King James III, fresh from the courts of Scotland, Lancashire was not just distant, it was dangerous. It had a reputation for defiance, for strangeness, for not quite falling into line. And at the centre of that strange land loomed Pendle Hill, a brooding presence in the mist, ancient, silent and watching. This is where Jennet Device was born, not in a castle, not in a manor, but in a tumble-down shack known as Malkin Tower. The name sounds gothic now, ominous, haunted, but it wasn't much more than a muddy hovel patched with sticks and hope. Even the word Malkin was an insult slang for a slattern, or worse, a word too crude for courtrooms but whispered in taverns. This wasn't a place for dreams, it was a place for survival. Jennet's family lived by begging, by mending, by odd jobs, by favours and grudges. But they had one other trade, one they did not advertise, yet everyone knew. Jennet's grandmother, Old Demdike, was what the villagers called a cunning woman. Not quite a healer, not quite a witch, more like a shadowy combination of doctor, midwife, herbalist, fortune teller, and sometimes yes, enforcer. She could cure your baby's fever, find your lost sheep, bless your harvest. But cross her, and your cow might die the next morning. In poor, rural England, cunning folk were both needed and feared. To the villagers, they were a safety net in a world without doctors or laws. To the authorities, they were one misstep away from blasphemy. Because under Protestant rule, things had changed. England had officially become Protestant some 40 years earlier. But change doesn't seep evenly through a land, especially not into the hills. In Pendle, the old Catholic rites still lingered. Crucifixes hidden behind cupboard doors, candles lit in secret, Latin prayers mumbled beneath breath, and perhaps worst of all, a belief in magic charms and spirits that the church now called satanic. In this climate, a cunning woman could become a witch with just the wrong look from a neighbour. And Old Demdike had rivals. One of them was Old Chattox, another cunning woman living not far from Malkin Tower. Their families had been locked in a bitter, muddy feud for years, trade territory, superstition, maybe even envy. Jennet's grandfather had once paid Chattox a tribute sacks of oatmeal each year to keep the peace. The year he stopped, he died. Coincidence? Not in Pendle. In Pendle, if your son fell ill, it was a curse. If your butter wouldn't churn, it was a spell. If your cow gave blood instead of milk, well then someone had certainly made a clay doll of you and buried it in the woods. This was Jennet's world, a world of whispered curses, hidden bones and muttered charms. A world where a little girl might grow up believing that her family had the power to kill with words. A world already soaked in fear, just waiting for one spark to light the fire. And that spark would come not from old Demdike, not from Chattox, but from a simple walk down a village lane, and a curse that might have actually worked. It began as these things often do, with something small, a word, a refusal, a pin. March 18th, 1612. A chill still hung in the lanes of Pendle Forest as Salem Device, Jennet's teenage sister, wandered along the path between two villages. She was begging as usual. She had no money, no prospects, and certainly no father to speak of. Survival depended on the whims of strangers and the luck of finding one generous soul who hadn't yet been asked that day. So when she saw the traveling peddler, a man with a heavy pack strapped across his back, she did what any beggar girl might do. She asked for a few pins. Pins, that's all. But the man refused. Maybe he thought she was filthy. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he just didn't want to open his pack. In any case, he walked on. Alazon cursed him, not metaphorically, not under her breath. She uttered a real, actual curse, the kind her grandmother might have used, the kind that felt like a small act of power in a world where poor girls had none. And then something happened. Moments later, the man collapsed in the road. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His face twisted, his limbs spasmed. He was found by villagers and dragged to a nearby inn, his body half paralyzed, slurred, his eyes wild. Alazon heard what had happened and froze. She ran to his bedside, sobbing, begging for forgiveness. She truly believed she had bewitched him. Not pretended, not performed, believed. But the man didn't recover. His son, outraged, reported the event to the local magistrate, a man named Roger Nowell. And Nowell was exactly the wrong man to stumble into if your family happened to be poor Catholic and possibly dabbling in charms. Nowell was not just a magistrate, he was an opportunist, a God-fearing Protestant in an age where Protestantism was less about piety and more about loyalty to the crown. He had read the king's book, Demonology, written by James I himself, and he saw in the rising fear of witches a ladder, one that could carry him higher, closer to power. And now, right here in rural Pendle, a young girl had not only confessed to witchcraft, she had named names. Alazon told him about old Chattox, her grandmother's rival, and claimed that Chattox had made clay effigies to kill people. Chattox, in turn, accused old Demdike, dragging Jennet's grandmother into the fire. The feud, long dormant, exploded under the weight of official scrutiny. Each woman eager to deflect blame, each name another domino falling toward the gallows. Nowell realized he had something far more than a petty dispute on his hands. He had a coventry, a ring, a network of witches hiding in plain sight in one of the kingdom's most disobedient corners. This wasn't just superstition. This was treason by the king's own reckoning. For in James's theology, witchcraft wasn't a crime against man. It was a crime against God himself. So Nowell started making arrests. Jennet's sister, Alazon. Her grandmother, Demdike. Chattox. Chattox's daughter. All dragged from their cottages and taken to Lancaster Castle, the looming prison fortress that would become the final destination for so many in this story. And back in Malkin Tower, the fires still burned. Jennet watched her world unravel, her home emptied, her family vanishing one by one into the belly of a castle she had never entered. The walls of the house seemed to creak with the weight of what had been said, what had been confessed. She was 9 years old, and the last one left. Outside, Pendle Hill loomed. Inside, her mother was preparing for Easter, but the celebration that was to come, the sheep stolen for meat, the guests gathered under the low beams, the neighbours huddled around a shared fire, would not be remembered as a holiday feast. It would be remembered as a witch's Sabbath. And when the knock came at the door, it would come not from the devil, but from the law. Easter, in the year of our Lord 1612, did not fall in a time of peace. The kingdom still reeled from the shock of the gunpowder plot, when Catholic conspirators had tried to blow up the king and parliament in a single righteous inferno. Since then, religion had not been a matter of private conscience. It had become a loyalty test. And on Good Friday, when all true subjects of the crown were expected to take communion in church absence, was not just a sin, it was a statement. Jennet Device was absent. So was her mother Elizabeth, who had not gone to pray. She had stayed home, and not in mourning or in piety or in quiet reflection. No, at Malkin Tower Elizabeth had thrown a party. There is no record of what the weather was like that day, but one imagines the wind stirring the heather, the fog curling around the hill, and the faint smell of meat roasting in the fire. Where it came from, a sheep stolen days, before perhaps by Jennet's older brother. The villagers would remember that detail well. It made the whole thing seem more profane. A holy day, a stolen lamb, a house full of the wrong people. Who were they? Friends, neighbours, supporters of the accused, already rotting in Lancaster Castle perhaps. But to Roger Nowell, to the Crown, to the Protestant imagination, already haunted by whispers of Catholic rebellion, they were witches. The story came from a rumour, as most witch hunts do. A constable heard that something unholy had taken place at Malkin Tower. He arrived unannounced and found exactly what he was looking for. People not in church. People eating meat on a sacred fast day. People talking in low voices with heads too close together and glances too quick to look innocent. Someone said there were more people at the gathering who had already left. Names were whispered. Names were taken down. And then came the accusation that turned a village gathering into a conspiracy. They were plotting to blow up Lancaster Castle, to murder the jailer, to free the witches already imprisoned within. It was a story straight from the shadow of Guy Fawkes. Treason, witchcraft, sedition, all wrapped in the smoke of a cook fire on Good Friday. Nowell acted swiftly. 8 more people were arrested and sent to join the others in the castle's cramped, fetid cells. The air in Lancaster was thick with more than just disease, it was thick with fear and with opportunity. The trial had begun as a local affair. Now it had momentum, it had weight, it had usefulness, and among those arrested one name stood out, Alice Nutter. She was not like the others, not a beggar, not a hedge dweller, not a cunning woman. She was gentry wealthy, educated a landowner. Her family was staunchly Catholic, with 2 relatives already executed as traitor priests. To Nowell, she was the missing link, the proof that this wasn't just local superstition, but part of something deeper. Something darker. Perhaps a Catholic plot cloaked in witchcraft. And Alice, by simply being present at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong religion, was enough. Did she attend the feast at Malkin Tower? Almost certainly not, but it didn't matter. She was accused, she was named. And in 1612 in England, that was often enough. So she was shackled, thrown into the castle alongside Jennet's mother, brother, sister and neighbours. In a space barely 20 feet wide, 20 souls sat stacked in misery. One by one they would be called. One by one they would be judged. But among the crowding, among the filth and silence, Jennet Device was not there. She was outside, waiting, listening, watching. And before long, she would be called to speak. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, not as a child, but as the voice that would condemn them all. She was 9 years old. She had no father, no status, no possessions. Just a ragged dress, a quiet gaze, and a memory sharpened by years of listening through cracks in the walls. And now she had something else, a courtroom. The trial of the Pendle Witches began on August 18th, 1612, in the heavy stone chamber of Lancaster Castle. The air inside was still oppressive. 2 judges presided. A jury of men sat ready. The clerk of the court, a man named Thomas Potts, sharpened his quill and waited to record history. Then the doors opened and Jennet Device entered. She was small, barely waist height to the men around her. She looked, as Potts would later write, modest, governed, and full of understanding. But when she opened her mouth, it was not with the voice of a child. It was the voice of someone certain. Her mother, Elizabeth Device, stood in the dock, hands bound. When she saw her daughter, she screamed. She cried out in anguish, pleaded, cursed. But Jennet didn't flinch. She turned to the judge and asked for her mother to be removed before she would speak. And they obeyed. Once Elizabeth was gone, the room fell into silence. Jennet climbed up onto the table, and then she began to speak. She told them of a spirit, a brown dog named Ball, who came to her mother and asked what she wanted him to do. And her mother answered, kill. She listed names men in the village who had died. She described the dog speaking her mother, whispering back the chill in the room when it happened. The judges leaned in. Potts scribbled furiously. The room had stopped breathing. But Jennet wasn't finished. She told them about Good Friday, about the gathering at Malkin Tower, about 20 people crammed into that crumbling home, eating stolen mutton, whispering spells. She named them one by one, and she looked them in the eye as she did it. She spoke of her brother James, how she had seen him conjuring, muttering charms, calling on spirits. She said he had stolen teeth from graves, buried them with clay dolls in the earth. She even repeated the words of his spells, half-remembered rhymes from old Catholic prayers twisted into superstition. Upon Good Friday I will fast while I may a cross of blue and another of red. It was not evidence, not in the modern sense, but in 1612 it was damning. It was enough. Her voice did not shake, and the courtroom believed her. By the time she stepped down, the verdicts were already forming. 10 people would hang her mother Elizabeth, her sister Alison, her brother James, her grandmother Demdike, though the old woman had already died in prison, buried beneath damp stone, before she ever reached the stand. Others too, Alice Nutter, Anne Whittle, Anne Redfern, neighbours, friends, all found guilty, all sentenced to die. They were taken one by one to Gallows Hill, a patch of earth that still exists, now softened by time, where children play football and dogs chase sticks. But in 1612 it was a theatre of death. There were no clean executions, no swift drops, just ropes and time and the strangling silence of the crowd. They climbed the ladder, the noose was tightened, and then they waited for the world to go dark. Some were pulled by the legs to hasten their end, some confessed, most did not. Elizabeth Device never confessed, not even with the rope around her neck. And somewhere in that crowd, perhaps shielded by a cloak, perhaps placed front and centre, stood Jennet. She may have watched, and if she did, the last thing her mother ever saw may have been her daughter's face. Most children vanish from the pages of history, their voices too soft, their footprints too light. But Jennet Device did not vanish. She was remembered not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as something far more unsettling, a precedent. After the executions, the dust of Pendle did not settle. Instead, it was gathered, bound, inked and published. A book bearing a title both pompous and chilling, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. Written by Thomas Potts Clark, of the court flatterer to the crown, an aspiring man of influence. He had sat through every word, every scream, every gasp. And he wrote it all down, not just as a chronicle, but as a performance. Potts didn't just record history. He crafted it, each paragraph polished to reflect what a loyal king might like to see: a firm hand of justice, heretics rooted out, witches hanged with elegance and order. And at the heart of it all stood Jennet. Potts wrote about her with near reverence. He marvelled at her poise, her clarity, her modesty, as she stood on the table and calmly destroyed her own bloodline. He did not question the morality, he praised the utility, because in her, Potts saw more than a witness. He saw a model. Jennet's words, so cold and so convincing, had done what no tortured confession, no neighbour's accusation, no folk rumour had ever quite managed. They closed the case. Her testimony was the linchpin of the entire trial, and Potts knew it. So he wrote it that way. And in doing so, he gave English law something it had never truly possessed: a child's voice as evidence. This book, Potts's carefully curated, politically sharpened narrative, was not left to gather dust on the shelves of scholars. It became a reference manual. Magistrates across England read it. Colonial judges in America read it. And in its pages, they found not just drama, but permission. Permission to believe children. Permission to accept stories of demons and spirits as proof. Permission to condemn based not on evidence, but on fear, repetition, and the performance of innocence. Years later, a legal guidebook would cite Potts's work explicitly. The author, a man named Dalton, instructed justices to refer to Jennet Device as an example of how the son and daughter of Elizabeth Device did, upon their oaths, give open evidence against their mother. And just like that, a child's betrayal became statute. It no longer mattered that Jennet was 9 years old, that her world was one of ghosts, and whispered spells and muddy superstition. What mattered was that she had been useful, and once a child's voice was accepted in Pendle, it would echo across decades, across oceans, all the way to Salem, where another group of children, eyes wide and voices trembling, would cry out against witches and be believed. And thus, a little girl from a forgotten hill in Lancashire became something more than a witness. She became a legal weapon. It had been 22 years, Jennet Device. Once the star witness of a kingdom was no longer a child. Whatever innocence had once clung to her had long since worn away, shed like an old shawl in the damp stone corners of Lancashire. She had disappeared from public record, melted into the grey anonymity of survival. And then in 1633 the past came knocking. It came with a boy, 10 years old. His name was Edmund Robinson, and like all great characters in this story, he was late for dinner. When his parents asked why, he didn't say he lost track of time. He didn't say he'd wandered too far. No, he said he had been kidnapped. Not by a man, not by a thief, but by two greyhounds. Greyhounds that, when struck with a stick, transformed before his eyes, one into a boy, the other into a woman. The woman turned him into a horse, rode him to a barn, and there he saw 60 witches' ropes hanging from the rafters, conjuring banquets out of thin air. And he ran. He ran so far and so long, he said that when he got home he was still covered in dirt and thorns and fear, and that he told his parents was why he was late. It should have ended there. A child's wild excuse, a tale forgotten before morning. But it didn't. His father took him from village to village, from church to church, standing him before congregations and letting him point out witches, women in the crowd who had looked at him the wrong way or not paid his father what he asked. It was theatre, it was politics, and it worked. Soon, over 20 people were arrested, swept up in a second great purge of Pendle witches. And among the names pulled from Edmund's mouth was one already known to the shadows of the courtroom, Jennet Device, the very child whose testimony had once been celebrated, recorded and held up as the model of truth, now stood in the dock herself. The same girl who had helped create the rules was about to be destroyed by them. But this was not 1612. This was a different England. The king was no longer James, fevered and terrified with ghosts in his chambers and witches in his dreams. It was Charles the Femme, now a monarch, more cautious, more suspicious of the religious fire that had fueled the witch trials of his father's reign. His queen was Catholic. His court was more sceptical, more cynical. And quietly the tide had turned. Jennet and the others were imprisoned once again in Lancaster Castle, but this time the judges hesitated. Something about the case didn't sit right, the story too wild, the evidence too thin. So they turned to science. The king sent his most trusted physician, Dr. William Harvey, the man who had discovered the circulation of blood, the man who dissected truth with a scalpel and a stare. He brought with him a team of doctors and midwives, and together they examined the accused, looking for the devil's mark, that mythical blemish from which demons suckled power. They found nothing. No unnatural growths, no secret nipples, nothing that could be called witchcraft unless one believed the human body itself was a crime. And then came the collapse. Under questioning from the Privy Council, Edmund Robinson cracked. He admitted the story was fantasy, that he had heard tales of Malkin Tower, of witches and Sabbaths, and Jennet Device. He had simply made his own version, a performance, and his father. He had used the boys' lies to extort money from frightened women, threatening to have them arrested unless they paid to stay unnamed. In the cold light of reason, the whole thing fell apart. Jennet was acquitted. But this is not a story with a clean ending, because in 17th century England, freedom came with a price, even for the innocent, especially for the poor. Lancaster Castle did not offer a key for free. If you could not pay your jail fees, room board, food, you stayed, acquitted or not, a prisoner of poverty. The records fall silent. We do not know if Jennet ever walked out of that prison, if she saw the sun again, if she returned to Pendle Hill, or was buried in a nameless grave beneath the moss. What we do know is that she disappears again, not in fire or rope, but in debt. Her words had once built a gallows. Now they built her cell. Time passed. Decades thickened into centuries. The names changed, the kings fell, the plagues came and went. But Jennet Device remained. Not in flesh, no one knows when she died or where. not in grave, for no stone bears her name, but in something more enduring, more dangerous, in precedent. Because while Jennet may have vanished from the jail records after 1636, she did not vanish from the law. Her words uttered as a 9-year-old beggar child standing on a table were now inked into legal handbooks, cited not as an aberration, but as authority. When a judge needed guidance on whether a child could testify in a case of witchcraft, he turned to Dalton's Country Justice, published in 1618. And there, amid chapters on vagrants and trespassers, under a neat subheading marked Witchcraft, he would read, "The son and daughter of Elizabeth Device, the one about 9 years of age, the other 14, did upon their oaths give open evidence against their mother." A little girl's betrayal had become law, and the echoes were not limited to England. They crossed the sea, whispering their way into courtrooms in Massachusetts, in a fledgling colony called Salem. There, in 1692, another storm of fear gathered. Another set of children stepped forward, eyes wide, hands shaking, voices rising in chorus against women they claimed were witches. The community believed them. The judges trusted them, and 19 people were hanged. On the magistrate's desk in Salem was a battered copy of Dalton's Country Justice. The page that justified the use of child witnesses was still marked. It had worked before. It would work again. So Jennet lived on, not as a person, but as a mechanism, a justification. Her voice had once rattled the beams of Lancaster Castle. Now it echoed across oceans, across centuries. A child's terror or jealousy or performance sharpened by the expectations of adults was now a legitimate blade in the court of law. And yet what makes her story most disturbing is not what it tells us about the 17th century, but what it tells us about ourselves. Because belief, true belief, is a kind of spell. It doesn't require evidence, only fear. And fear is timeless. We would like to believe we're past it, that our modern world, with its science and its skepticism, would not burn witches or trust the trembling finger of a frightened child over the weight of truth. But we've simply changed the names. We don't call them witches anymore. We call them terrorists, groomers, enemies of the state, the dangerous other. And we still build gallows not of wood and rope, but of headlines, hashtags, and laws rushed through in panic. We still believe that children cannot lie, and when they do, we don't want to know. So Jennet's story isn't just history, it's a mirror. One in which a frightened little girl standing on a table in 1612 stares back at us. And the question she asks quietly, steadily, is this: what would you believe if the whole room wanted you to? Pendle Hill still stands. It rises quiet and wind-scoured, watching over the green of Lancashire like a memory that refuses to die. The sheep still graze. The heather still blooms. And now and then a tourist might wander the trail, unaware that they are walking through a ghost story. No stones mark the resting place of Elizabeth Device, or Alison, or James, or Jennet, but perhaps a gravestone was never needed, because they are still with us, in the way we cling to fear when facts feel uncertain, in the way a lie repeated often enough becomes a kind of truth, in the way we raise children to speak for us and sometimes to destroy for us. Jennet was not a monster. She was not a prophet. She was a child caught between survival and obedience, between silence and performance, between truth and what the world wanted her to say. The table she stood on is long gone, but the stage that never really disappeared. We've just given it microphones and cameras and courtrooms with different names, and maybe, just maybe, that's the part of the story that should frighten us most.